No one gets to choose their parents. We all inherit a story, like it or not. But we can choose what to do with that story. I'm Mike Joseph. The story my parents gave me was full of life and loss, wars, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. What should I do with that legacy? What would you do? I was 50 before I did anything at all. Welcome to Keys, a Troubled Inheritance. My mother was 18 when the SS forced her from Germany at gunpoint. My mother Lily and all her family, who were soon to be slaughtered by the same SS. But Lily and one sister escaped to Britain, and after the war, when they asked the caretaker of their parents' house if anyone had returned, the answer was no, nobody. But the house was still there in Leipzig, and so was the Nazi propaganda chief Ralph Dippmann, who took their house during the war. Half a century later, I'm in Leipzig, I've been to the house, and I've met Dippmann face to face, shouting Nazi propaganda at me to keep hold of the house. And Leipzig City has also blocked restitution to prioritise the restoration of their city. So, Lily has resorted to petitioning the Queen. This is summer 1992. The Queen is enjoying her summer holiday cruise of the Scottish Islands, away from the cares of state and the turmoil in her immediate family. But every day at 11 a.m. she still receives her papers. Her private secretary, Robert Fellows, takes a letter from his wicker basket, passes it to her, and she reads,
Madam, with my humble duty, I and a number of friends heard the news of your forthcoming visit to Leipzig with very mixed emotions. We were all born in that city of well-established Jewish families, with good homes, businesses, professions, and much property there. With the advent of the Hitler regime, we were systematically deprived of our human rights and civil liberties, and, from 1938 onwards, deported to be slaughtered.
My mother's letter of petition to the Queen is surely the high point of her lifelong campaign for some justice for her lost family. As we will soon hear, Lily's intervention was well judged, resulting in an energised British government response. The narrative, shared and repeated by Britain's refugee Jewish community, esteems the monarch as head of a country that rescued and welcomed those few who managed to escape Germany. Central to this constructed memory is the Kindertransport movement, celebrating the rescue of some 10,000 Jewish children from Central Europe in 1938 and 9. There is less attention to the parents of those children, trapped in Hitler's Europe, refused visas for Britain. There is no attention at all to the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian children and their parents who were driven from their ancestral homes by Jewish militia in the 1940s, while British soldiers looked on, and Britain was washing its hands of its 30-year mandate for Palestine.
And elsewhere. It is intolerable that we should have to suffer further delay and injustice. The Leipzig authorities are defying the intentions of German legislation, as well as common justice, in seeking to use us for the economic restoration of their city. We therefore ask you to intercede for us, in order that our rights might, at long last, be respected in our former hometown. I have the honour to be, Madam, Your Majesty's humble and obedient subject, Lily Gold.
The Queen's reply comes by return.
At sea, 14th of August 1992. Dear Mrs. Gold, the Queen has commanded me to thank you for your letter of the 12th of August. Her Majesty was grateful to you for writing to her and read your letter with much sympathy. This is not a matter in which the Queen could personally intervene, as I am sure you will understand. but I have sent your letter to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office so that they may be aware of your approach to Her Majesty and can let you know whether there is anything to be done to help you. Yours sincerely, Robert Fellows.
Lily Gold's letter now spreads rapidly through Foreign Office and embassy circles. David Wootton of the Foreign Office Nationality, Treaty and Claims Department writes to colleagues.
This is a sad case. Mrs. Gold, a survivor of the Holocaust, feels justifiably aggrieved that the unification of the two Germanys appears not to have brought about the solution she's been seeking for more than 50 years. Her complaint to the Queen is that the Leipzig authorities are not treating her application speedily enough, at least not without conditions. I think we should copy this correspondence to Peter Waterworth in Bonn and let Mrs. Gold know that we are doing so.
Hayward, Foreign Office, to Mrs. L. Gold, 25th of August.
The Queen's private secretary has sent me your letter of the 12th of August addressed to Her Majesty. I was sorry to hear that the Leipzig authorities appear to be dragging their feet. It must be very frustrating for you. As you know, talks on claims issues such as yours are continuing with the Germans on a government-to-government basis. I have therefore copied your letter to our embassy in Bonn. It is useful to have the information you have provided as it helps us in our negotiations.
The following month, it was my turn to follow up the Foreign Office. Perhaps my mother was not well. I call David Wootton, who had engaged so warmly with the case in August.
Yes, indeed, Lily Gold. One of our most famous cases. I've just written to her saying her case is looking pretty hopeful. We talked in Bonn earlier this month with the Germans. It is a direct result of her case that we took this up with them. We complained that restitution officials in Leipzig are simply dragging their feet. Bonn admitted it was not good enough, and they're drafting in new staff. The signs are good. We will write to all claimants about progress, and we have another meeting with the Germans before the end of the year.
Is the end finally in sight? On the 5th of October, my mother receives David Wootton's letter. It seems to confirm all he said to me.
In our talks with the Germans, they've indicated that on the evidence available to them, restitution is likely to be successful. But...
And here comes the but.
But successful claimants may have to pay a levy on their restituted property.
A levy? What levy? What new mischief is this? By now the state visit is underway. On the 22nd of October the Queen arrives in Dresden. Protesters throw eggs and call Weg mit Harris, away with the bomber Harris statue. The Queen attends a service at the Kreuzkirche, sitting in silence while the Prime Minister of Saxony declares that we belong together in Europe in spite of all that has happened. After 1 hour in Dresden, no more, she leaves. The Leipzig crowds are 5 times larger and much friendlier. The Queen and Prince Philip spend 5 minutes on the balcony of the Altes Rathaus, the old town hall, alongside Mayor Heinrich Lehmann-Gruber and his wife, waving to the crowd on Marktplatz. She meets leaders of Leipzig's Monday night marches that brought down the communist regime. After 3 hours, she leaves the welcoming city. Did the question of a levy on successful claimants come up during her meeting with Lehmann-Gruber? I doubt it somehow. But several weeks later, the Foreign Office is also still trying to clarify the matter. On the 20th of November, Michael Sullivan, head of the Foreign Office Claims Department, circulates claimants with the current understanding.
Successful claimants will be required to pay a levy which is intended to help fund compensation for others who are unable to have their property restored to them. The sum is likely to represent less than 1/3 of the current value of the property. We're pursuing this matter further with Germany.
I reply to Mr. Sullivan. I note that you're pursuing this matter further with Germany. Can I offer a compelling reason for your doing so? I then go on to quote from Martin Gilbert's History of the Holocaust.
In the aftermath of the Kristallnacht pogrom, German Jewry was fined for the damage done. The fine, 1,000 million marks, was levied by the compulsory confiscation of 20% of the property of every German Jew.
I continue. We should not suppose that Germans are unaware of the precedent. When, in 1991, I confronted Herr Ralf Dippmann, the Nazi propagandist who was awarded my mother's house by the German state in 1943, he instantly referred to this fine as the justification for my mother's loss and his gain. You may wish to point out to the Germans that Britain is also aware of the precedent for German state use of Jewish funds against Jews. In 1938, Germany levied 20% of the property. In 1992, Germany plans to levy less than 1/3 of the current value of the property. So, what has changed? 4 days later, Sullivan writes that he has forwarded my letter to the German Foreign Ministry and encloses a general update.
Although we have argued strongly that a levy should not be imposed on British claimants, Germany has told us they believe that even after deduction of the levy, most, if not all, British claimants will be better off.
Well, in fact, the German plan to have successful claimants funding unsuccessful ones ignites a 9-month storm of Foreign Office criticism, which escalates to an international dispute. Hayward to Sullivan, February.
The draft compensation law includes a clause applying the 30% levy to Jewish expropriated property. The US has already protested vigorously. It was outrageous.
Anstead to Wootton, February.
You may wish to consider whether we should brief the Prime Minister on the possible German levy on Jewish expropriated property.
Dixon to Wootton, March.
Our worst fears are confirmed. Money raised from victims of Nazi persecution by way of levy will go for the benefit of contemporary victims of inhumane treatment. One can hardly believe one's eyes. This self-financing scheme seems to have all the intellectual content of 2 fingers. Anything we've said to the Germans seems to have been a complete waste of breath. The Germans probably feel they can tell us anything. We are now so ignorant of the early history of these arrangements. You cannot resolve Nazi wrongs as you would the historically very different communist ones. The new law is a departure from principles built into the Federal Republic from its very beginning. We view the implications with grave concern.
Hayward to Sullivan, March.
It's most extraordinary that some of the victims should be asked to pay a levy to compensate other victims. The state is not discharging its liability.
Dixon to Sullivan.
The state was arguably the major beneficiary of the forced sale and confiscation of property in the Third Reich. It cannot, in justice, opt out of compensation arrangements.
Dixon to Wootton, April.
The federal government continues to speak with forked tongue. They will be willing to tolerate unfairness and contradictions in the interests of ruthless economy. It was never intended by the Western powers that compensation measures for victims of National Socialism should in some way be self-financing. The notion is grotesque.
Sullivan to Heath, April.
It's threatening to become more of a political issue than a claims one. Together with their rejection of our Channel Islands proposal, the FRG's determination not to provide government finance to pay for claims against the former GDR may lead to serious international criticism.
Sullivan to Wootton, April.
The US have raised a number of points similar to those made by Mr. Dixon and seem to be thinking in terms of making a joint démarche to the Germans in Bonn.
A démarche is a formal international protest, government to government. Waterworth, British Embassy, Bonn, to Sullivan, April.
My US counterpart will propose a tripartite meeting, including the French. Depending on the outcome, a tripartite high-level démarche could be proposed. At this point, you do need to be aware that there could be a high-profile political problem in the offing.
Dixon to Wootton, May.
The bill needs fundamental revision. It is unjust and ill-considered.
Dixon to Wootton, October.
Good news! The bill has been thrown out at committee stage as unconstitutional. Out goes the ruthless economic logic embodied in the iniquitous self-financing principle. and out too, consequently, the objectionable property levy. I confess I had not seen this dramatic turn of events coming.
On the 12th of May 1993, I sat in the office of Frau Fleming in Leipzig's Neues Rathaus, the city hall, to receive the formal restitution of my mother's house. It was 50 years since Nazi propaganda chief Ralph Dippmann had taken it from my family. And it turned out, James, that restitution of my mother's house was the first such restitution in Leipzig out of all those tens and hundreds of thousands of claims. Quite why that should be, I have no idea.
It certainly sounds from some of the correspondence that you've uncovered that your mother's interventions, and indeed your own intervention, were very important in, what shall we say, sharpening the attitude of the British government to what was going on in Germany.
It was a combination of perhaps the embarrassment of that approach to the Queen, which at the very least put civil servants on notice that what they were going to do would be watched more closely. But I think more to the point, there was quite a telling comment in one of those Foreign Office papers that we just heard, that the Germans clearly expected the British to have forgotten their history. I mean, we're talking 1990s, that's 30 years ago now, but even then, 30 years ago, it was still a lifetime away from the post-war reconstruction of Europe and the reconstruction of Germany, to bring it into a decent relationship with the rest of the post-war world. Long enough to forget. And Britain has indeed forgotten that history when it comes to Israel-Palestine, because at the same time as Britain and the West was requiring Germany to observe a fundamental duty of reparations to allow its readmission to the civilized world, it asked the same of Israel, to permit return and property compensation for Palestinian refugees as a condition of admission to the United Nations. And Britain renewed the demand in the UN Security Council immediately after the Six-Day War in 1967 and Israel's occupation of the rest of Palestine, calling for refugees to be allowed to return. Today, Britain has apparently forgotten this history, but somehow, in 1992, Germany was different. Britain, and also France and the US, understood perfectly well that Germany was trying to incorporate East Germany on the cheap and airbrush its historic obligations. It wasn't going to wash.
Well, they may have thought that the British had forgotten their history, but they'd also forgotten that there were people like your mother who'd been banging on about this ever since the end of the war. And they certainly hadn't forgotten it, and the injustice was still very raw with them. And clearly somebody like your mother felt that now at last that a democratic government has taken control of the whole of the territory of Germany, the time has come when the justice which she'd been waiting for would be done, and she would have expected it to be done because she knew that the government of the Federal Republic were well aware of her claim, or well aware of what had happened, and that she'd been trying to get something done about it as far as she could. For what, 40 odd years?
45 years, absolutely. And her files were full of that. And of course, also, my childhood and teenage years were full of it because I was so aware that that's what she was doing. It was part of the landscape as I was growing up. So in a sense, I was overexposed to it. And in a rather perverse way, I could almost sympathize with the civil servant who we heard earlier on, describing how, well, yes, he's sympathetic to my mother, but she, her endless phone calls were beginning to get a little burdensome. I get that, but maybe you don't make an omelette without breaking eggs.
You understood, I'm sure, why it meant so much to her, but something made you get more actively involved? Was it because your mother was getting older and couldn't manage it on her own, or what?
Okay, well, I think that deserves an honest answer. It was probably over-predicted that I would get involved. I mean, like you, I was a journalist. This was a story. It was a story of my own family, and it was an important story that deserved a wider hearing. So that's basic. She'd been pursuing this all her adult life, and it was clear that she needed support, she deserved support, and I could support her. But there's actually one other factor. I very desperately needed to find a way back to a position of mutual respect and understanding with my mother from probably the time of the Six-Day War onwards. My mother and I were increasingly at odds over Israel's occupation of Palestine. What everything got distilled into was our increasingly bitter rows over the occupation. She would defend Israel's actions as they escalated through the 60s, 70s and 80s, and I became increasingly critical. And it was really going nowhere fast. It was a very unhappy situation. We were both, in a way, increasingly stubborn in our own positions, and we needed to find a way back to each other. This was a very practical way in which I could say, hey, I can actually help. I've got some relevant skills and knowledge. I can get over to Leipzig. I can take over. Why don't we give it a try?
Well, of course, once you went to Leipzig, you found yourself face to face with a real live Nazi, which not many people in your position have experienced that, I wouldn't have thought, of being directly face to face with someone who, although he wasn't directly personally involved in the persecution of your mother and her family, he was certainly part of that whole machine, and more to the point, he was still benefiting from the actions of that Nazi machine.
That's absolutely right. It was all unexpected. It was, I mean, I was out of my depth from the moment he exploded in anger at me. I'd put it a little stronger, actually. It isn't the case that he was not really responsible for persecution. He was absolutely responsible for not simply taking the Nazi gift of a cut price property in Leipzig for his services to the Reich, but he then did the whole thing again in the 1950s when he accepted the re-award of the title by the communist East German state. And by doing that, he ensured that my mother was never free of the duty to try to recover the house for the whole of her adult life. He actually destroyed what was left of her happiness and her, such as it was, after she lost her family. So really, she had focused, and I think rightly, her bitterness and her anger at the destruction of the Nazi regime very much on this one individual. He was already a notorious name in our household. To actually find him alive, sitting there, and angry with me, shouting at me, and expressing Nazi propaganda straight out of the history books. You could pick up any book on German history, on the history of the Third Reich, and find Dippmann's words there. He'd forgotten nothing and learnt nothing. So it was a very vivid education that the past is never past, especially not when it's sitting there in front of you. And that drove me, obviously, to then, after the house was recovered, to saying, well, actually, nothing is really achieved until I recover the story of her family, who were lost in some killing field somewhere in Eastern Europe.
And you didn't know the details of that at all at this stage?
Nothing.
Do you have some sympathy with the attitudes which obviously were obstructive to you, but can you understand why both the bureaucrats, the politicians, and indeed the ordinary people in the street were concerned about people coming from away? Might be Jews, they might be other Germans, they might be anybody coming saying, this is ours, we want this back, we're going to do this, we're going to do that.
Yes, I can understand it. It was absolutely in your face. As soon as you got out of the main station in Leipzig in the 1990s, it hit you. The place was a crumbling ruin. It was in a state of advanced decay. which was a tremendous shock, given that all I'd ever heard about Leipzig from my mother was its glorious days in the 1920s and 1930s, a real cultural capital of Germany. And what this place was, it was covered in a pall of dense smog from the brown coal that was burnt. The buildings were literally crumbling, propped up with great stanchions of timber where the maintenance hadn't happened for 50 years. The entire structure of the East German welfare system, which was quite astonishingly comprehensive, had been swept away overnight. So people were not only suddenly out of work, unemployed, and risking and threatened with homeless, they didn't have the safety net of a welfare system to support them. It was the roughest possible introduction that the whole population of East Germany could have had to the capitalist free West. Totally sympathized with them. And I had one of my colleagues in my workplace in Cardiff was an unemployed East German teacher. That was a genuine cause for alarm, and it was something that was treated by West Germany with hostility and suspicion and scorn. It was, I absolutely, totally sympathized with them, which was why I felt that the way in which the leadership in Leipzig was in effect trying to create this false opposition between, on the one hand, Jewish foreigners coming in, demanding their rights from some forgotten period of history against the rights of ordinary East Germans to have a roof over their heads. That was a false contradiction, a false opposition, and it was pretty cynical, the way I saw it happening. And I'll put the question back to you, actually, James, because I've not only visited Leipzig frequently since reunification, but so have you. You've been in there. So let me ask you this. Is Leipzig a derelict place? Is it a no-hope, dead-end kind of a city with no future? Or is it a thriving metropolis with everything you would expect in a Central European city? What did you see when you were there?
Oh, a very fine city, yes. I'd never been there before until just a few years ago. And beautiful city, very efficient-looking city. Buildings are in marvellous condition. There's still some renovation going on, but certainly, yes, there's some very fine buildings to be seen, very efficient public transport system, the sort of city one would like to live in.
And it is described as one of the most livable cities in Europe, and rightly so. And all that, despite all the attempts by both Leipzig and the federal German government in Bonn to resist restitution, despite all those attempts being eventually ruled as unconstitutional and unethical, Leipzig's reconstruction and rebirth has just been a soar-away success. So, one of the lessons of history. There is, I think, before we move on, one touching postscript to this story. When my mother died a few years after the events we've just been recalling, David Wootton, who was one of the Foreign Office civil servants whose words you've just been voicing, wrote this epitaph.
During my time in Nationality, Treaty and Claims Department, it was always a privilege and a pleasure to assist your mother. Of the many claims cases that I handled, hers was the one that touched my heart, and I only wish that I could have done more for her. I always enjoyed talking to her on the telephone and could well understand her frustration at what must have seemed like very slow progress in resolving matters. She fought hard for a just cause. May she now rest in peace.
So, more than 45 years later, she gets the house back. Did she then rest in peace?
I brought the keys of her recovered house and I gave them to her. Mm-hmm. You knew your grandmother. She wasn't often lost for words, but this time she just stared at them in silence. And her reaction to the house keys showed me just how useless the keys were. They were keys to a house without her family. Mm. Lily knew loss so personally, so intimately. And she lived with that loss every day for the rest of her life. So all I could do now was try to discover her family's story.
She focused all of her bitterness and anger on Dittmann, this individual. Why do you feel like this wasn't enough in the end when it came down to it?
I think it's something we maybe all come to at different times in life when we've experienced a loss or a shock or what have you. We need to be able to do something. You know, sometimes organising a funeral is just a way of coping with the sudden bereavement. But the Keys actually told Lily, that's done, that's achieved. It's her achievement, it's our achievement. Justice as far as it can be done, and justice for Dipman as far as that can be done, have been achieved.
Yeah.
Did that give her peace? That's your question. No, the honest answer, it didn't, and it couldn't. Because what could give her peace was something that could no longer ever be. Her family back with her. They had gone, and that absence, I'm sure, became even starker with the recovery of the house. I didn't have to carry that burden of loss, but I still could do something in response to her emptiness, to her grief, and that was to find the truth of what happened to her family. And that's what I did next.
So, how do you find the family's killers?
My idea was that I should follow my family's footsteps from as early as I could trace them, and then following them all the way through from Germany to Poland and finally to Ukraine. Because if I did that with enough care, that would surely lead me to their killers. And as we're going to hear, I was led to their killers, something that we will hear in future episodes. What I did not know is that it would also lead me to Palestine and to another tragedy, the disaster of expulsion, the Nakba, which is also symbolized by keys. In their case, the keys to their homes that Palestinians took with them in their flight and have kept ever since. Keys of grief over loss and keys of longing for return.
Thanks for listening to Keys, A Troubled Inheritance, an investigation by Mike Joseph into genocide, ethnic cleansing, and one family. This was episode 5. There's information on the whole series and upcoming episodes at mikejoseph.wales.